Hello, guys, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 2, Rising Action with Renna Germain. Hello, guys, and welcome back to the Inked Podcast. Today, we are diving into the next large plot point on our journey, and that is the Rising Action. Joining me today to help me break this down and talk about this is Miss Renna Germain. So, how are you doing today, Miss Renna?
I'm doing good.
Well, that's good. I will forewarn you to our listeners, I am a little congested right now because it is allergy season. Um, so I promise I am well, just a little bit of congestion. So we're fine. Um, for those of you guys who do not know Rena, she is one of my dearest friends, and I am so excited to have her on today. And believe me when I say that I often go to her for advice, so I hope her insights will be as helpful to you guys as they have been for me. So, that being said, we can now proceed with our first question. Are you ready to go, Rena?
Yes, I'm ready to go.
All right. Our first question is, what is rising action in your own words?
I always think of rising action as after the main character starts off their journey, it's all the obstacles leading up to usually what's a like middle of the story twist or big important moment. The rising action is everything that leads up to that, all the trials and problems and fights, and if there is fights in your story that happen in between those 2 points of the big middle point and then the character going off on their journey in the beginning.
Yeah. So, we see when you look at a plot chart, you see that the rising action is the moment from the exposition to your turning point. Um, So it's that point in the story where things start kind of heating up a little bit. You see that there's gonna be a moment of choice for your character, and so it's just kind of the building from your exposition to your turning point. So our next question is, why is rising action so important?
Ooh, I like this question. Rising action, at least in my opinion, is really important because it's where you can put all the foreshadowing. It's very key for character development and just generally getting to know your characters, getting to develop character dynamics and their personalities a little bit more, and seeing different sides of the character, and even possibly hinting at villains and possible big battles to come if you're writing fantasy and all the fun stuff like that.
Yeah, it's just kind of important because without that rising action, you like I said a minute ago, it's that point that happens before your turning point. So if you don't have your rising um if you don't have your rising action, then your turning point is just going to seem like this sudden decision that's thrown at your character. So, a story that I keep using in this whole season of the show is my first book of my series, The Amulets of Avalon. And the example that I have of that showing the importance of this is if my character hadn't gone in his expedition, okay, he's on the farm, he lives with his family, they have a good life. But if there hadn't been the rising action of him getting a message that he was drafted into the army, then there never would have been that moment of choice for him. And so that's just kind of why it's important, because without that, it would have just been okay, he lives on a farm, suddenly he's in war. He suddenly decided to go to war. There's no reason or rhyme as to why he decided that. It's just, okay, he's made this decision. So, what are, speaking of examples of rising action, what are some of your favorite examples of rising action from one of your books?
Oh boy, this is a hard question. In the novel that I recently finished editing, my main character is trying to take down this evil baron in her kingdom, and part of her rising action is building a team of sorts to go after this big bad villain. And her rising action, a lot of it is her, one, getting to where she knows people are, then trying to convince them, and then getting to know them and getting to lean more on them as allies, and actually going through all of that in a slower way, because you can't just go from, oh, I have this, I made this decision to fight this big bad villain. Now I have
Hmm.
allies. Okay, we're fighting the villain. You need all that in between to
The
develop your side
mingling.
characters, to build that team, and there's you need all of that, and that's the rising action of doing all that stuff to reach that next point of the team is formed and
Yeah.
then continuing the journey.
It's kind of the rising action is basically um your mingling point. So when I say mingling, I mean like your characters are talking to each other, they're making a plan, they're figuring it out. So like everything is changing for them. And so it's yeah, it's just that period of and like you said earlier, you talked about why it was important in terms of like your character. Um and like how they develop so much more in the rising action because it is the rising action and like that's the point that's leading up to their moment of decision, that's leading up to the climax, all of that. And so yeah, it's just it's it's a very valuable part for your character in particular. But speaking of characters and rising action, how does this is a question I did not prepare Rena for, so she does not have an answer. It is no worries. But the question is, how does your rising action affect your side characters? Because obviously your main character is going to be heavily affected by this because it's like their life is progressing, their life is going on. But like what exactly how does it affect your side characters? What happens in their minds when they're in this moment of rising action?
I like this question a lot. My answer may not be the most
It
coherent,
doesn't have
but
to
we're
be
gonna
though.
try. Um, One of the things I really like about Rising Action is actually like using that to develop side characters. And this is very much the point when you can bring in those smaller side quests and allow your side characters to have some agency in the story where they get to make choices and they get to affect the plot, because there's a lot more room in the rising action than some of those bigger moments for them to have their chance to shine,
Mhm.
have their chance to do their
Yeah.
thing, or make choices of their own that you can highlight in this story and make the story world and the characters so much more rich and interesting and intriguing with all sorts of things, because they're making their own decisions, they're following their own character arcs if they have them, they're adding to and influencing the story and the main character and the villains possibly, and all of that.
Yeah. That makes sense. I can definitely see how realizing action does play a huge part in like your side characters because you can develop them. You can kind of play with them a little bit. And like you can show kind of how they interact with your main character and everything during your rising action as well. So like that's a great thing to think about when you're thinking about your rising action is how does it affect your side characters? Um, so obviously we've already stated kind of where rising action falls in the grand scheme of things. But going back to what I said about why is rising action so important, besides characters and like besides for the sake of this is challenging both of us because I am not prepared to answer this question much either. But besides your characters and besides your basically just your plot points, why is rising action what it is? Why is it so important to have this moment of or have this long span of time in between your exposition and your turning point and your climax? Why is it so important to have this one thing right here?
I The reason I see it as so important is because, and this ties into like character arcs and also plots a lot, is you need that time to let the story breathe occasionally between all the intense moments. Two, it allows for like a more almost a more realistic and more intentional story of where it's like you have that time and you need that time in real life to like grow and change. It doesn't always happen as a light switch. And so it's good to have that in stories where you have the time for the characters to change in
Mhm.
subtle ways. Maybe not always like some dramatic change, but in like little ways, like making a right decision here, making a better decision there, and growing and building up to the point where then you can realize and have that hit moment of like, oh, I changed a whole lot over all these little things, and you need those little things and
Yeah.
that time in order to make the bigger moments more impactful, more emotional, and
Yeah.
all of that that makes a story
Yeah,
really good.
it's definitely the rising action is a chance to get some fluff. So like you talked about all of there being all these big things that happen and like major plot points and like things that are like scary or intimidating or like big huge massive moments in time. But the rising action and falling action, which we'll talk about way later, is just it's your ability to add some fluff in there, to give your reader and your characters a little bit of a break, to give them kind of a reprieve of life is happening, things are happening, I'm going through this dramatic thing. Like, it gives them like a moment of fluff to where they just get to be, okay, maybe I want to go like sit with my friend on a swing and like look at the stars. Like, maybe that's what's happening in your rising action because like they have, oh, I have this feeling that something's about to change. Like, it's just giving that character a little bit of fluff and like a little bit of a break. Well, that is all of the time we have for today's episode. So thank you, Rena, for coming on. I'm really glad you could be here.
Of course, happy to be
And
here.
as always, thank you to our listeners for being here, and we will see you next time. Bye, guys.